Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Settle in somewhere comfortable. Let your shoulders drop a little. Maybe the room around you is already quiet. Maybe there is still some noise drifting in from another part of the house. Maybe you are listening with the lights off and the day finally beginning to loosen its grip. Wherever you are, I hope you can rest here for a while, because tonight we are going into a war that many people think they already understand, and we are going to approach it from a direction that almost never gets much attention. Not through helicopter assaults, not through jungle firefights, not through television footage of smoke rising over distant tree lines. We are going to look at the rules, the orders, the limits, the things a United States soldier in Vietnam was told he could not do, even while standing in the middle of one of the most confusing and violent conflicts in American history. And that may sound at first like a dry subject. Regulations, prohibitions, military discipline, the kind of language that usually lives in handbooks and memoranda, written in stiff sentences by men in offices far from the mud. But stay with me tonight, because once you begin to see how many boundaries followed these soldiers into Vietnam, the war changes shape. You start to understand that combat did not free a man from rules. It surrounded him with them. Some were moral, some were practical, some were meant to preserve order, some were meant to protect civilians. Some existed because commanders were terrified of what could happen when thousands of young Americans, many barely out of high school, were dropped into a foreign country under constant stress, carrying rifles, earning military pay, and living in a world where danger and boredom kept taking turns. The Vietnam War was full of things soldiers were commanded to do. Patrol this road, search that village, secure that landing zone, hold this perimeter. But beneath all of that was another quieter layer of service, made of restrictions. Do not go there. Do not say that. Do not carry this. Do not buy that. Do not drink here. Do not fraternize there. Do not mistreat a prisoner. Do not bring home what you found. Do not embarrass the United States. Do not forget that even here, especially here, you're still under military law. Before we move into that world, let me ask you something simple. What time is it where you are right now? Are you listening late at night, with the day already behind you? Or is this playing softly while you work, clean, travel, or try to quiet your thoughts? And where are you listening from tonight? A bedroom, a couch, a parked car, a city apartment, a small town somewhere far from the places we will be discussing. If you feel like sharing, leave it in the comments. I genuinely enjoy seeing how far these stories travel, because history often feels old and sealed away until you realise people are meeting it together in real time from thousands of different rooms. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you find comfort in slowing down and walking carefully through the overlooked corners of the past, it would mean a lot if you subscribed and gave the video a like. No rush. Do it when the moment feels right. For now, let us step carefully into Vietnam, not at the height of battle, but at the moment a soldier begins to learn that the war will govern far more than his movements in the field. Picture a young American soldier arriving in South Vietnam in the late 1960s. He has crossed an ocean, probably after a long chain of processing stations, troop flights, briefings, and waiting rooms. The heat reaches him before anything else. It does not simply sit in the air, it presses. It settles into the cloth of his uniform and turns the metal buckle of his belt warm against his skin. The smells are unfamiliar. Jet fuel, diesel exhaust, wet earth, dust, sweat, cooking fires, canvas, and the faint sourness of too many men in too little shade. Around him there is constant movement. Trucks, forklifts, clerks, military policemen, helicopters lifting somewhere in the distance, men shouting over engines, others sitting on duffel bags with the flat look of people trying not to think too far ahead. He's arrived in a country that has already been explained to him in broad terms: communism, insurgency, pacification, search and destroy, friendly villages and hostile villages, though very quickly he may discover that the neat categories of briefing rooms do not always survive contact with real roads, real families and real fear. But one thing will be made clear to him from the beginning. He has not entered a lawless place. He has entered a place where regulations multiply. Vietnam was not presented to US forces as a zone where ordinary conduct no longer mattered. Quite the opposite. Soldiers were repeatedly reminded that they represented the United States, that they were expected to obey military authority, and that their behaviour toward Vietnamese civilians, local customs, security rules, and restricted areas was subject to official scrutiny. In some cases, those expectations were condensed into pocket-sized cards meant to be carried, read, and remembered. The 9 Rules of Conduct card, for example, instructed American troops to respect Vietnamese people, avoid rude behaviour, show politeness toward women, and give local civilians the right of way. That small card says something important. The army understood that a soldier's conduct off the battlefield could matter almost as much as his conduct during a mission. One loud insult, one arrogant gesture, one careless act in a village or market could worsen the relationship between Americans and the population they claim to be protecting. This is where the subject becomes more revealing than it first appears. When people imagine what soldiers were not allowed to do in Vietnam, they often leap immediately to the most dramatic rules. They think of atrocities, prisoners, war crimes, illegal killings, the boundaries between combat and murder. Those matter deeply, and we will come to them. But ordinary prohibition begins lower to the ground. It begins with everyday control. Where can a soldier go after duty hours? Which bars or neighbourhoods are off limits? Can he move freely through a city at night? Can he exchange money however he pleases? Can he take photographs in every location? Can he discuss his unit's activities openly in a cafe? Can he wear his uniform any way he likes once the immediate pressure of combat eases? Military life in Vietnam was full of these restrictions, and the reason is not hard to understand once you imagine the command problem. Hundreds of thousands of American service members were spread across bases, airfields, ports, advisory compounds, rear areas, jungle camps, and city districts. Some were in daily combat, others worked supply, communications, intelligence, medicine, maintenance, transport, or clerical jobs. But every one of them remained part of a military structure that feared indiscipline almost as much as enemy action. Commanders knew that misconduct could create security risks, damage alliances, fuel resentment among civilians, or trigger political embarrassment at a time when the war itself was already becoming bitterly controversial back home. Regulations were not decoration. They were a way of trying to keep a huge, stressed, armed population from unravelling. Whether they worked consistently is another question. Often, they did not. But they existed, and soldiers knew they existed. There is something almost strange about this when you pause to consider it. A young man could be sent into a landscape where death might arrive from a concealed mine, a sniper in the tree line, or a burst of fire during a night ambush. He might be trusted with grenades, machine guns, radios, explosives, and the lives of the men beside him. Yet the same institution that put those responsibilities on his shoulders might also tell him he could not enter a certain district after dark, could not deal in certain forms of currency, could not disobey a movement restriction, could not interact with civilians in ways deemed improper, could not keep enemy weapons as personal trophies, could not publicly say just anything he wanted while in uniform, and could not decide for himself which orders deserved obedience and which did not. That contrast is worth sitting with. War places enormous responsibility on individuals and then, at the same time, removes enormous areas of personal choice. A civilian waking up in America in 1968 might read about Vietnam in the newspaper and argue over the war at the breakfast table. A soldier in Vietnam lived inside it, but he did not possess full liberty to speak, move, act, trade, drink, collect, protest, or improvise simply because he was closer to the danger. In many respects, he possessed less liberty because he was closer to it. The rules were part of the uniform. They followed him from training to transport, from barracks to checkpoints, from club doors to courtroom proceedings. That point matters because the Vietnam War is often remembered as chaotic, and it certainly was. The jungle did not always reveal who was friend and who was enemy. Command priorities could change. Villages suspected of aiding guerrillas might later receive aid. Soldiers learned that body counts, pacification reports, and actual control on the ground did not always tell the same story. American public opinion shifted dramatically over the course of the war. Units faced fear, fatigue, racial tensions, drug problems, morale collapse in some areas, and a growing sense among certain troops that they were serving in a conflict whose purpose had become hard to explain clearly. Yet military law did not vanish into that chaos. It adapted unevenly. It was sometimes enforced firmly and sometimes selectively, but it remained present. Thousands of courts-martial were tried during the war, and military legal authorities had to confront everything from ordinary discipline problems to grave crimes against civilians, along with drug use, fragging, desertion, and racial conflict. The existence of those cases tells us something essential. Vietnam was not merely a battlefield. It was also a legal and disciplinary environment, with commanders, investigators, lawyers, judges, and regulations attempting to define what a soldier could and could not do, while the larger war kept shifting under their feet. Now imagine that same young soldier several weeks after arrival. He's no longer stunned by the heat. It is simply part of life. He has learned where to find cold water, where the shade falls at a certain hour, how quickly boots sour, how red dust settles into every crease of gear, how men start using nicknames before they learn full names. If he's assigned near a large installation, he may see a world that is almost city-like in its activity. Repair bays, mess halls, bunkers, perimeter towers, concertina wire, posted notices, command buildings, laundry lines, chapel services, aircraft overhead, and endless walls of paperwork that somehow continue to exist even in wartime. Somewhere on a bulletin board there may be a list of off-limits establishments. Somewhere else, a notice about curfew. There may be rules about passes, local travel, black market transactions, unauthorised weapons, the handling of government property, or contact with the press. There are guidelines about respecting Vietnamese customs and not acting as though the country is a playground built for foreign troops. There are rules that sound almost parental. There are rules that sound diplomatic. There are rules that sound like emergency measures, and behind all of them is a simple message. You may feel as though the war has carried you to the edge of the ordinary world, but the chain of command still reaches you here. This is one of the reasons the topic deserves more attention than it usually receives. Rules reveal what an institution worries about. If commanders prohibit a behaviour, that tells us they believed it was possible, tempting, dangerous, or already happening often enough to require control. Restrictions on off-limits areas tell us that certain places were associated with crime, disease, unrest, security concerns, or diplomatic friction. Rules on currency tell us that black market activity and financial disorder mattered. Rules on treatment of civilians and prisoners tell us that military leaders understood how quickly battlefield conduct could become morally and strategically disastrous. Rules on political expression and public statements tell us that dissent inside the armed forces was not an imaginary fear. Rules on souvenirs and captured weapons tell us that some soldiers were collecting pieces of war, whether out of pride, curiosity, grief, or the urge to bring home proof of what they had seen. Restrictions do not appear out of nowhere. They are shadows cast by real behaviour. A list of what was forbidden is never only a list, it is a map of temptation, anxiety, and control. And Vietnam produced a great many anxieties. US forces were operating in a sovereign allied country, not on American soil. That mattered. Official Army history notes that American personnel were expected to comply with Vietnamese laws involving traffic, curfew, off-limits areas, and currency, and that the legal status of US forces in South Vietnam was a matter of ongoing command concern. In plain terms, A soldier did not enter Vietnam and become exempt from the fact that another government existed around him. The American military had power, immense power, but it also had to manage its presence in a country whose population was not simply scenery. A soldier racing a jeep through a crowded street, insulting a shopkeeper, violating curfew, or ignoring a local rule was not just being reckless. He risked becoming a tiny living symbol of occupation in the eyes of people whose cooperation the United States claimed to need. That is why some of the first restrictions we will examine are so ordinary on the surface. They concern speech, appearance, movement, and daily conduct. But under those ordinary rules lies a much larger question. How do you maintain discipline when war makes men feel that ordinary limits no longer fit their lives? There is another layer here, and it is quieter. Not every rule felt equally serious to the men living under it. A prohibition printed on a card might be read once and forgotten. A command briefing might be endured with half an ear. An off-limits bar might become more appealing precisely because it had been forbidden. Anyone who has ever been young understands this instinct, and most enlisted men sent to Vietnam were very young. The average American combat soldier in Vietnam is often described as being around 19 years old, though age varied by service and assignment, and that fact matters because adolescence and military authority make an uneasy combination even in peaceful settings. In Vietnam, that combination was exposed to danger, loneliness, alcohol, racial friction, homesickness, sexuality, boredom and sudden violence. Commands against misconduct were not delivered to monks in a cloister. They were delivered to tired young men living far from home under conditions that regularly strained judgment. Some followed the rules carefully, some bent them, some broke them. Some came to believe the rules made sense only in rear areas, not in the field. Others were disciplined by superiors who themselves were trying to preserve a structure that seemed to grow more fragile as the war dragged on. The regulations are important not because every soldier obeyed them, but because they formed the official boundary line between acceptable service and punishable conduct. That boundary line could be thick or thin depending on the offence. Some violations led to a dressing down, loss of privileges, extra duty, or a minor disciplinary action. Others led to confinement, court-martial, dishonourable discharge, or imprisonment. A soldier who wandered where he should not might face one kind of consequence. A soldier who stole military property, assaulted a civilian, used prohibited force, or disobeyed a lawful order could face something far more severe. And then there were situations where rules collided with fear. A patrol enters a village after taking fire nearby. Men are exhausted, angry, frightened, and convinced that someone among the civilians knows more than they are saying. What exactly are they not allowed to do? Where does interrogation end and abuse begin? What can be taken? What can be destroyed? What must be protected even when the soldier feels that protection is undeserved? These questions were not theoretical. They sat behind official pocket cards, Geneva Convention reminders, directives, and courtroom records. The military tried to provide answers. The war repeatedly tested whether those answers would hold. What makes this subject so compelling is that it pulls the Vietnam War away from the broad slogans that usually surround it and returns us to the daily life of people trapped inside it. What soldiers were not allowed to do is not merely a legal question. It is a human one. It asks how a 19-year-old from Ohio, Texas, California, Alabama, or New York learned to live under rules in a place that often seemed to violate every rule he thought governed normal life. It asks what commanders feared their troops might do if left unwatched. It asks how military discipline functioned under pressure. It asks why some prohibitions were repeated so insistently that the repetition itself becomes evidence of trouble. It asks why a soldier could be forbidden to speak openly about certain matters, forbidden to enter certain places, forbidden to keep certain objects, forbidden to approach certain people in certain ways, while still being ordered into situations where restraint demanded more courage than aggression. That last point is easy to miss. Sometimes what a soldier was not allowed to do required more discipline than what he was ordered to do. Not firing, not striking, not taking revenge, not helping himself to whatever the war placed in front of him, not turning a foreign country into a personal release valve for fear and frustration. Those prohibitions speak to the best hopes of military order, even if reality did not always meet them. So tonight, we are not going to treat regulations as background noise. We are going to listen to them. We are going to follow the forbidden paths, the posted notices, the pocket cards, the curfews, the command warnings, the legal limits, the temptations they reveal, and the consequences when men crossed them. We will move through the war not only by battlefield and year, but by restriction. What could not be said? What could not be worn or publicly displayed? What could not be refused? Where a soldier could not go? What he could not bring back? How close he was allowed to get to civilians? Which pleasures became disciplinary problems? Which forms of anger became crimes? Which acts were banned because commanders wanted order? And which were banned because without those prohibitions the war threatened to become even more brutal than it already was? The first boundary was not found in a jungle clearing or at the entrance to a village. It was closer than that. It lived on the body and in the mouth. Before a soldier ever broke curfew or crossed into an off-limits district, before he pocketed a forbidden souvenir or violated a rule about civilians, there were things he was not free to say, ways he was not free to present himself, and opinions he was not free to display without consequence. In a war that divided the United States more deeply with every passing year, even a uniformed man's words could become dangerous territory. There is a simple thing most civilians do without much thought. They complain out loud about a president, about a policy, about a war, about the boss, the government, the people making decisions far away from the place where the consequences are being felt. They say it at a dinner table, in a bar, over coffee, in a letter, sometimes with great care and sometimes with no care at all. In ordinary civilian life, a man can mutter that the people in charge have lost their minds, and unless he is unlucky enough to be saying it into a microphone at work, the moment usually passes. But for a United States soldier during the Vietnam War, especially as the conflict grew more divisive in the late 1960s, speech was never quite that simple. The uniform did not remove every opinion from a man's mind. The army itself acknowledged in 1969 that soldiers did not have to agree with every policy of the government, and that they retained a right to express opinions on public matters. But that right narrowed quickly once an opinion became public, organised, contemptuous, disruptive, or visibly attached to the authority of the armed forces. A soldier could think many things. He could privately doubt. He could quietly resent. He could write home in language that would have shocked his commanding officer. Yet there were lines around what he could say openly, what he could display on his body, and how far he could go in opposing the war while still remaining inside military discipline. That distinction matters because by 1968 and 1969, the Vietnam War was no longer merely a distant military campaign argued about by senators and professors. It was inside the barracks. It was inside mess halls, transport ships, hospitals, stateside bases and replacement depots. It followed men into letters from home, newspaper headlines, and television broadcasts showing protests in American cities. Some soldiers still supported the war. Some believed in the mission but hated the way it was being fought. Some had lost faith in it entirely. Some had never wanted to go in the first place. The armed forces were not sealed away from the national argument. They were one of the places where that argument became most tense, because the people being asked to fight the war were increasingly aware that millions of civilians back home were openly questioning it. This created a problem commanders could not ignore. Dissent inside the military was not treated as identical to dissent outside it. In civilian life, a protest sign might be seen as an expression of conscience. In military life, the same sign could be interpreted as a threat to discipline, morale, or obedience. The question was not simply whether a soldier disagreed with policy. The question was whether that disagreement would remain personal or begin to look like organised resistance inside an institution built on command? One of the clearest restrictions fell on commissioned officers. Under Article 88 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, an officer could be punished for using contemptuous words against the President, the Vice President, Congress, the Secretary of Defence, the Secretary of a military department, or certain state officials. That rule was not written specifically for Vietnam, but Vietnam gave it real force. It meant that an officer who chose to attack national leaders in insulting, degrading, or openly contemptuous language was not speaking with the same freedom as a civilian holding a placard on a sidewalk. The best-known Vietnam-era example was Second Lieutenant Henry Howe. In 1965, while on active duty in Texas, Howe joined an anti-war demonstration and carried a sign that denounced President Lyndon B. Johnson in harsh terms. He was not marching in Vietnam. He was not addressing troops in a jungle camp. He was off base. Yet he was still an officer, and the military convicted him of violating Article 88. His case became the landmark example of how criticism of the war could cross into punishable speech when it came from someone wearing the legal responsibilities of a commission, even if the uniform itself was not on his body at that exact moment. That point is easy to misunderstand. The military did not declare that every negative word about Vietnam was illegal. A soldier was not automatically court-martialed for saying the war was badly run, or that he wanted to go home, or that he no longer believed the mission made sense. The Army's 1969 guidance on dissent recognised that disagreement with government policy was not, by itself, forbidden. But military law did create wider openings for punishment when speech appeared to damage good order and discipline, bring discredit on the armed forces, encourage refusal of duty, or undermine the authority of the chain of command. Article 134 of the UCMJ, sometimes called the General Article, was broad enough to cover conduct judged prejudicial to military discipline or discrediting to the service. That meant enlisted men, though not subject to Article 88 in the same way officers were hardly living in a speech free-for-all. A private who wrote an angry letter home was one thing. A group of soldiers distributing material that encouraged disobedience, mutiny, or refusal of duty was another. Commanders were especially alert to the difference between complaint and organisation. One was irritating, the other could look dangerous. The military's growing concern became official policy in September 1969, when the Department of Defence issued Directive 1325.6 on handling dissident and protest activities among members of the armed forces. That directive did not arise in a vacuum. It appeared after a period in which anti-war sentiment among service members was becoming more visible, and commanders were trying to define what could be tolerated, what could be restricted, and what crossed the line into direct challenge. The policy framework recognised that service members had some expressive rights, but it also emphasised the commander's need to preserve order, readiness, and discipline. In practice, this meant a soldier's protest rights shrank as soon as his actions intersected with military space, military duty, military appearance, or military authority. He might be allowed to hold an opinion. He might even be allowed to voice it under certain circumstances. But he could not assume that a base, a formation, a barracks wall, or a uniform was his personal platform. The military was trying to prevent the war inside the ranks from turning into an open campaign against the war itself. This is where clothing becomes far more important than it seems. A uniform is practical, of course. It tells men what branch they belong to, what rank they hold, what jobs they perform. But during the Vietnam era, as in other periods of American military history, the uniform also carried authority. It was not just fabric. It was the public face of the armed forces. That meant a service member could not freely use it as a costume for political dissent. When active duty troops appeared at anti-war events in uniform, commanders often saw more than an individual exercising a personal opinion. They saw the symbolic power of the military being redirected against the policies of the government it served. That was exactly what made such acts effective to protesters and alarming to the Pentagon. The uniform said, in a way civilian clothes could not, that opposition existed not merely outside the military but within it. For commanders already worried about morale and discipline, that image was difficult to tolerate. Susan Schnall understood that power very well. She was a Navy nurse, a lieutenant junior grade serving during the war, and increasingly horrified by what she saw as the human cost of American policy. In October 1968, she helped publicise the GI and Veterans March for Peace in San Francisco. She also took part in a dramatic leaflet drop over military installations in the Bay Area. The night before the march, she was given ALNAV 53, a Navy regulation stating that service members were forbidden to wear uniforms at political demonstrations. She wore hers anyway. At the protest, her uniform made her impossible to ignore. She was not a civilian criticising the Navy from the outside. She was a Navy officer walking at the front of an anti-war demonstration in full public view. The Navy later court-martialed her, and in early 1969 she was found guilty of charges connected to her anti-war activity, including wearing the uniform at a partisan political event. Her case became one of the clearest examples of what the military would not allow, using the uniform itself to turn dissent into public spectacle. The rule against political display in uniform did not mean every soldier presented himself like a parade mannequin at all times. Vietnam was full of field improvisation. Men rolled sleeves, altered gear, tied cloth around helmets, wore lucky objects, scribbled names, dates, jokes, and hometown references on equipment. Combat zones developed their own rough visual language, and not every deviation from regulation becomes a disciplinary case, but there was a difference between informal personalisation and deliberate political signalling, especially when that signalling was visible to officers, reporters, or the public. A peace symbol pinned to civilian clothes might be ignored in one setting. A similar symbol worn as an anti-war statement by a uniformed soldier could be interpreted differently. The more official the setting, the more sensitive the display became. A soldier in fatigue speaking to reporters, appearing at a demonstration, or standing before a crowd was not simply dressing himself. He was presenting the image of the military to the country. The armed forces were determined to control that image, particularly at a moment when public confidence in the war was beginning to erode. There was also the matter of written expression. Soldiers read newspapers, they wrote letters, they produced underground GI publications, they signed petitions, they passed around flyers, and commanders watched all of it with increasing interest. The Army's 1969 guidance on dissent did not say that every anti-war article or petition was forbidden. It did, however, allow commanders to restrict the distribution of materials on military installations under certain circumstances, especially if those materials were unlawful or encouraged disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty. Later court records discussing the era show how sharply authorities worried about the circulation of anti-war materials inside the ranks. Base distribution was not treated like handing out pamphlets on a city corner. A barracks, a mess hall, or a post exchange sat inside the command environment. What circulated there could be viewed as affecting unit morale and discipline directly. In other words, the written word became dangerous not because paper itself frightened the army, but because organised paper could move through a unit quietly and quickly, linking men who had believed they were alone in their doubts. Petitions made this tension even more obvious. A soldier had rights. He could communicate grievances to Congress. That principle was important and would remain a contested subject into later court cases. But circulating a petition among service members, especially on base and especially about military matters, could still trigger command intervention. During the Vietnam era, anti-war petitions became a visible form of internal dissent because they transformed private opposition into a list of names. A commander could no longer treat discontent as scattered grumbling when dozens of men had signed a public statement against the war. The Courtright v. Reesor case, arising from activities among members of the 26th Army Band at Fort Wadsworth in 1969 and 1970, showed how uneasy commanders could become when soldiers signed anti-war petitions and appeared connected to public peace activities. The court record described officers worried not merely about disobedience, but about the public exposure of dissent within a military unit. That distinction matters. A soldier complaining under his breath might be tolerated. A soldier adding his name to a public anti-war statement could be seen as helping create an organised bloc inside the service. What is striking in these records is how often military leaders said some version of the same thing. They acknowledged that soldiers were citizens. They conceded that service members did not become mindless instruments simply by entering uniform. But then came the limit. In the military, speech could not be allowed to weaken the ability of a unit to obey orders when obedience became urgent. In the Courtright case, one officer testified that on the battlefield there could not be opposition to anything, a revealing phrase because it captures the command mentality of the time. He was not trying to write a theory of democracy. He was expressing the anxiety of a military institution fighting a controversial war while fearing that the culture of protest outside the gates might enter too deeply inside them. The concern was not always that dissenting soldiers would immediately mutiny. Sometimes it was that they would create hesitation, mistrust, bad publicity, or a perception that the army itself lacked confidence in the mission. In a war increasingly measured not only in territory but also in legitimacy, that perception mattered. The same issue appeared in relation to public demonstrations. A service member could not assume he was free to join any protest in any condition. Policies developed during the era and codified more fully in later directives restricted participation in demonstrations when troops were on duty, in uniform, overseas, or when the activity threatened order or discipline. The logic was plain. A civilian at a protest represents himself. A uniformed soldier risks being seen as representing the armed forces, or at least as suggesting visible fracture within them. That was especially sensitive during the Vietnam War because anti-war protest was not an occasional background noise. It became one of the defining features of American public life. Marches grew, moratorium events spread, veterans and active duty personnel increasingly appeared in the same spaces. To the military, that blurred line between civilian protest and internal opposition could not be treated casually. The uniform had to remain tied to obedience, not converted into a badge of organised resistance. And yet many soldiers still opposed the war. This is the part that makes the subject more human and less tidy. Rules did not erase conviction. They shaped the form conviction could take. Some men kept quiet until discharge. Some wrote careful letters. Some turned to off-base coffee houses, underground newspapers, or private conversations. Some signed petitions. Some marched out of uniform. Some appeared in uniform despite orders, accepting the risk because they believed the symbolism was worth the punishment. Some cases ended in reprimands or transfers. Others ended in court-martial. The military's restrictions on expression did not prevent dissent from growing. In some cases, the attempt to suppress dissent made it more visible. Punishing a soldier for speaking could turn him into a symbol. Restricting a publication could make men more curious to read it. Transferring a dissident could spread his ideas somewhere else. Command authority remained real, but it did not always produce silence. Sometimes it produced a louder argument about what loyalty meant in a war many soldiers no longer trusted. There is something difficult in that tension, and it deserves to be looked at without rushing toward an easy verdict. Armies need discipline. That is not merely a slogan spoken by generals. A unit under fire cannot function if every order becomes a seminar. A platoon cannot vote on whether to move when men are pinned down. A nurse cannot abandon her ward because she objects to policy. A pilot cannot decide mid-mission that the war is unjust and simply turn away. Military service narrows personal freedom because it relies on coordinated action, especially in danger. But the Vietnam War raised the cost of that narrowing because the men and women being asked to obey were living through a conflict that many increasingly believed had become morally compromised, strategically confused, or politically dishonest. The rules told them what they could not say too publicly, what they could not wear too symbolically, and how they could not oppose too visibly. Their own consciences did not always fit neatly inside those boundaries. So imagine a soldier in 1969 sitting on the edge of a bunk after mail call. He has just opened a letter from home describing a protest in Washington. Or perhaps a brother who has started college and is writing angrily about the war. Or parents who insist he should ignore the protesters and do his duty. Around him, other men are reading their own letters, laughing at some, swearing at others, growing quiet at the names of friends who have been wounded or killed. He may feel something forming in him that is more than fatigue, doubt perhaps, resentment, the sense that the people directing the war do not fully understand what they are demanding. He can think it, he can whisper it, he can maybe write it. But if he is an officer, he cannot publicly pour contempt on national leaders without risking prosecution. If he is enlisted, he cannot assume broad protection if his words are judged to damage discipline or discredit the service. He cannot simply put on his uniform and march under an anti-war banner as though the military insignia on his chest belong only to him. He cannot freely turn a barracks into a political organising centre. The limits are there, even when they are unevenly enforced, and the knowledge of those limits affects every choice about whether to stay silent, speak carefully, or cross the line. That is the part of wartime discipline we often overlook. It is not only a matter of punishment after the fact, it is the pressure before the decision, the hesitation before signing, the glance over a shoulder before passing a leaflet, the quick thought before saying what one really believes in front of the wrong person. The uniform was not only worn on the body, it reached into speech, public behaviour, and the visible display of conscience. During the Vietnam War, a soldier did not stop being an American citizen, but neither did he enjoy the same expressive freedom as the civilians debating the war from campuses, churches, and city streets. The military allowed some disagreement, worried about much of it, and punished certain forms when they seemed to challenge command itself. That is why the restrictions on speech and appearance matter. They show us that one of the first battles many soldiers faced was not in the jungle, but inside the narrow space between what they believed and what they were permitted to show. And once a man learned that even his words, his clothing, and his public loyalties were being watched, another question followed naturally. What happened when the issue was no longer expression, but obedience itself? What was a soldier allowed to refuse, and what orders could he not simply walk away from, even when instinct, fear, or conscience told him otherwise? That question mattered in Vietnam more than most soldiers probably understood when they first arrived. Speech could be watched. Uniforms could be regulated. Public protest could bring punishment. But obedience sat at the centre of military life in a deeper way than all of those things, because once an order was given, the room for personal choice could narrow almost instantly. A soldier could be tired. He could be afraid. He could believe a mission was poorly planned. He could think a lieutenant had no idea what he was doing, or that a captain was sending men into danger for nothing. None of that by itself gave him the right to refuse. The military did not function on personal agreement. It functioned on lawful command. During the Vietnam War, as in any other American conflict, a service member was not allowed to simply decide that an order was unpleasant, risky, inconvenient, or foolish, and therefore optional. If the order was lawful, disobedience itself could become a crime. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, willfully disobeying a lawful command from a superior commissioned officer fell under Article 90. Disobeying a lawful order from a warrant officer, non-commissioned officer, or petty officer fell under Article 91. Failing to obey lawful orders or regulations more generally fell under Article 92. The wording is important. Not every command deserved obedience, only lawful ones. But once an order met that standard, refusing it was not a matter of personal style. It was punishable military misconduct. Imagine a soldier at a fire support base in the Central Highlands, or near a muddy road in the Mekong Delta, or standing in a staging area before dawn, while officers lean over a map spread across the hood of a jeep. He's told that his squad is moving out. Maybe it is a patrol through thick brush where visibility disappears after 10 yards. Maybe it is a village sweep. Maybe it is convoy security on a route that has been hit before. Maybe it is night listening post duty beyond the perimeter wire. He might feel fear settle into his stomach before anyone has taken a step. He might have a bad feeling about the route. He might have watched the same kind of operation go badly the week before. He might even be right. But he could not say, in effect, "I do not like the odds, so I am staying behind." The American military treated obedience to lawful operational orders as essential, and the law reflected that. The battlefield did not become safer if men could opt out at the moment danger became real. It became unmanageable. Commanders understood that, and so did soldiers. One of the first lessons of military life was that fear did not cancel duty. This is difficult to sit with from the comfort of civilian life, because most of us are accustomed to negotiating our obligations. We decline invitations. We challenge bad workplace decisions. We avoid situations that feel unsafe. Soldiers in Vietnam could complain, and many certainly did. They could grumble under their breath, swear about officers, make dark jokes, or insist in private that a mission was pointless. But when the order came and it was lawful, complaint did not replace compliance. That was the nature of the institution they had entered. A man could be ordered into rain, mud, exhaustion, and uncertainty. He could be ordered to remain at a post long after his nerves were frayed. He could be sent back onto a trail that already carried ugly memories. He was not allowed to turn obedience into a personal referendum each time. The law spoke in formal language, but its daily meaning was plain enough. You went. And yet this is only half the story. The other half is far more unsettling, because the American military also made clear that obedience had a boundary. A soldier was not allowed to refuse lawful orders, but he was also not allowed to hide behind an unlawful one. The Army's 1956 Field Manual on the Law of Land Warfare, the manual that framed US understanding during the Vietnam period, stated that violating the law of war because a superior ordered it did not automatically erase criminal responsibility. It acknowledged the pressure of wartime obedience and recognised that soldiers could not be expected to perform careful legal analysis in every chaotic moment. But it also drew a firm line. Members of the armed forces were bound to obey only lawful orders. If an order was unlawful, especially in a way that a reasonable soldier should understand, following it did not transform the act into innocence. That distinction sounds simple when written in a manual. It becomes far more difficult when imagined in the field. Soldiers are trained to react quickly. Hesitation can get people killed. Commands are sometimes shouted over gunfire, through radio static, across roads, around the edge of a rice paddy, from one frightened man to another. The Army's own manual recognised this reality. It noted that, in conditions of war discipline, service members could not be expected to weigh every legal question with delicate precision. That sentence matters because it shows the military understood the tension. Obedience was necessary. Blind obedience was dangerous. But the place between them was not always easy to stand in, especially for a young rifleman receiving an order from an officer who outranked him, during a mission he only partly understood, in a country where fear could distort everything. There is a habit, when discussing unlawful orders, of imagining something unmistakably theatrical. A villainous officer issuing a command in a dark room. A subordinate instantly recognising evil and dramatically refusing. Real war rarely arranges itself so neatly. Unlawful conduct may arrive wrapped in euphemism. It may be justified as necessity. It may be framed as retaliation, security, or clearing an area. It may be implied rather than spoken directly. It may depend on what troops believe they have been told about who counts as enemy and who does not. Vietnam was full of uncertainty about civilians, guerrillas, hamlets, local loyalties, and invisible threats. That uncertainty made discipline and lawful conduct even more important, not less. The Army's Law of War manual emphasised that the laws of war bound individual service members, and that military necessity did not excuse conduct forbidden by those laws. In other words, danger did not make everything permissible. Confusion did not erase limits. No event exposes this issue more painfully than the massacre at My Lai on March 16th, 1968. American soldiers from Charlie Company entered a Vietnamese hamlet during an operation against suspected enemy forces. What followed was not a battle in the ordinary sense. Hundreds of unarmed civilians, including women, children and elderly people, were killed. Later investigations, trials and historical studies would make My Lai one of the central moral crises of the entire war. It became inseparable from the question of orders, responsibility, and what soldiers were expected to do when command, fear, anger and illegality began to merge. An army-sponsored study of the massacre describes how only 3 Viet Cong were determined to have been killed by helicopter gunners during the operation, that American forces were not fired upon in the village, and that only 1 US casualty resulted from a soldier shooting himself in the foot to escape the killing. The same account notes that Lieutenant William Calley was eventually convicted in 1971 of the premeditated murder of 22 Vietnamese civilians. What is often remembered about My Lai is the horror of what happened. What deserves equal attention here is what it revealed about the limits of obedience. The law did not permit American soldiers to murder unarmed civilians because an officer wanted an area cleared. The law did not permit the deliberate killing of children because troops believed the village had aided the enemy. The law did not turn civilians into lawful targets simply because the operation had been preceded by frustration, casualties, or hostile assumptions. The Army's own teaching materials on My Lai continue to frame the event around precisely these questions. How soldiers should recognise unlawful orders when they must say no, and why doing nothing in the presence of misconduct is itself a moral failure. The fact that such questions remain central decades later tells us how deeply the massacre became attached to the problem of obedience in American military history. The figure who stands most clearly on the other side of that tragedy is Chief Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr., the helicopter pilot who flew over My Lai and saw American troops killing civilians. He did not treat what he witnessed as routine. He did not conclude that because infantry officers were on the ground, everything must therefore be lawful. According to the Army study, Thompson landed his helicopter between American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians, ordered his crew to cover the soldiers with their weapons if necessary, helped villagers escape from a bunker, and reported the massacre through his chain of command immediately afterward. His action is remembered because it was morally brave, but it also matters for this particular subject because Thompson understood that military obedience was not meant to protect unlawful violence. He acted as though the rules still existed when others had abandoned them. There is something almost unbearable in the contrast. In one part of the field, soldiers carried out killings that later generations would study as a warning. In the sky above them, another soldier looked down, recognised that something had gone terribly wrong, and intervened against men wearing the same uniform he did. It would have been easier for Thompson to keep flying, easier to assume someone else would handle it, easier to convince himself that ground commanders knew what they were doing. Instead, he moved toward the danger and made clear that rank did not sanctify murder. When we talk about what soldiers were not allowed to do in Vietnam, this is among the most important answers. They were not allowed to treat unlawful orders as a shield. They were not allowed to surrender all personal responsibility at the feet of command. Still, it would be too simple to turn this into a neat moral formula. Soldiers were not judges standing in quiet courtrooms with time to consider precedent. They were young men in difficult circumstances, often taught to obey quickly and punished for hesitation. The Army's field manual recognised that, when it said courts should consider the realities of war discipline when judging the defence of superior orders, that meant a soldier who carried out an illegal command might still argue that he did not know, and could not reasonably have been expected to know. The order was unlawful. The manual allowed that possibility. but it did not allow every order to become an escape hatch. There was a difference between a doubtful order in a confused situation and a plainly criminal act. Deliberately killing helpless civilians sat far beyond that line. This tension shaped more than famous atrocities. It hovered over everyday interactions with prisoners, detainees, and civilians. A soldier could not decide that a captive was worthless and abuse him for information. He could not simply take revenge on villagers because his unit had suffered a mine strike nearby. He could not interpret broad suspicion as a license for cruelty. The laws of war, as outlined in the Army Manual, placed binding limits on the treatment of civilians and enemy personnel, and violations by US troops could be prosecuted under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The manual also stated that commanders had a responsibility to ensure war crimes committed by their forces were promptly and adequately punished. These were not just rules for pamphlets or legal classrooms. They were meant to govern conduct in the exact kinds of moments when rage and fear pressed hardest against restraint. There is another part of this that often gets lost because we tend to focus on the soldier who says no. But refusal did not always take the form of a noble stand against an illegal order. Sometimes refusal was simple disobedience, and it could endanger other men. A soldier who abandoned a post, ignored a defensive instruction, failed to report when ordered, or deliberately shirked a duty was not performing a moral act. He was violating the structure that kept units functioning. Article 92 of the UCMJ covered failure to obey orders or regulations and dereliction in the performance of duty. The broad wording matters because discipline in wartime depended on countless acts that did not look dramatic when considered one at a time. Standing watch, keeping radio procedure, remaining where assigned, securing equipment, reporting as ordered. A war effort can be weakened not only by grand betrayal, but by ordinary refusal repeated across thousands of exhausted people. By the later years of the Vietnam War, discipline problems became a genuine concern in parts of the American force. Official histories of military justice in Vietnam describe a service wrestling with misconduct, desertion, insubordination, and a wider breakdown of order in some areas as the war dragged on. That does not mean the entire military collapsed. It did not. Many units remained effective and disciplined. But command authorities increasingly confronted the reality that repeated deployment stress, doubts about the mission, racial tensions, drug use, and a deteriorating homefront consensus could affect obedience itself. The line between protest and refusal and mutiny, mutiny and violence against superiors became a subject of real anxiety. That background matters because the legal rules against disobedience were not abstract. They were part of a daily struggle to keep the armed forces coherent during a deeply unpopular war. The harshest moments of that breakdown would take other forms, including assaults on officers and so-called fragging attacks, which belong more fully to another part of this story. But even before violence reached that point, the question of obedience had already become strained. A squad ordered out on another patrol might resent the lieutenant issuing it. A rifleman might think a mission existed only to produce numbers for reports. A rear area soldier might openly curse the war and test how much he could get away with. A serviceman facing hazardous duty might imagine that refusing was more honest than pretending loyalty he no longer felt. Yet the law still demanded obedience to lawful orders, and the chain of command still had the power to punish when that demand was ignored. The moral challenge was not that every refusal was wrong, or every order deserved compliance. It was that the soldier had to distinguish between fear, resentment, disagreement, and genuine unlawfulness while living under conditions designed to make judgment harder. This is why the phrase lawful order carries so much weight. It sounds bureaucratic, almost bloodless. In practice, it divided two entirely different worlds. On one side stood the order to move, guard, report, deploy, search, hold, or secure, even when a soldier hated it. On the other side stood the order that violated law and conscience in a way no uniform could excuse. The Vietnam War did not erase that dividing line. It made the line more urgent. It forced soldiers to live with the fact that obedience was both necessary and limited, both demanded and restrained. A man was not allowed to refuse simply because he feared what waited ahead. He was also not allowed to commit a crime simply because someone above him gave the command. That is not a comfortable rule. It asks a great deal of people under stress. But it was the rule all the same. By the time an American soldier understood that fully, he had learned something about Vietnam that training manuals could only begin to explain. The war was not merely a place where bullets flew and helicopters came in low over the tree line. It was a place where authority pressed down from above, fear rose up from the ground, and a person's judgment could be pulled in both directions at once. Every order arrived inside that pressure. Some had to be obeyed without delay. Some should never have been given. Some demanded courage to carry out. Others demanded courage to resist. And after that realization settled in, another set of restrictions waited just outside the perimeter, because obedience was not only tested in combat, it was also tested by where soldiers were allowed to go, when they were allowed to leave, and how tightly the military tried to control their movements once the firing stopped for the day. There is a point in every soldier's day when the war seems to pause, or at least pretends to. The rifle has been cleaned. The patrol has returned. The boots come off, if only for a little while. Somewhere nearby, somebody's laughing too loudly at a joke that was not especially funny, because fatigue makes men generous with laughter. A radio crackles. A truck shifts gears on a road beyond the wire. The air is still hot, even after sunset, and for a moment a soldier might imagine that the hours ahead belong to him. Not the army, not the war. Him. He might want to walk into town, buy a drink, see something other than sandbags and canvas roofs, sit in a bar with a ceiling fan turning overhead, hear music, spend money, talk to strangers, or simply go somewhere that does not smell like his own unit. But in Vietnam, free time did not always mean freedom of movement. A soldier could be surrounded by miles of open country and still not be allowed to cross a gate. He could be stationed only a short distance from a city and forbidden to enter it. He could hold a pass in 1 week and lose the privilege the next. He could be told that after a certain hour, the roads belonged to danger, the city belonged to curfew, and his place was back inside quarters whether he liked it or not. The wire around an American installation was not merely there to keep enemies out. It also marked the point beyond which a soldier's movement became something to be controlled, approved, denied, or punished. This is one of those parts of the Vietnam War that photographs do not always explain very well. We have seen the iconic images of men walking through rice paddies, jumping from helicopters, moving along jungle trails, crouching behind walls in ruined streets. Those scenes suggest motion, constant motion, an American military pushing through a country in every direction at once. But outside combat operations, movement was often restricted with remarkable care. US personnel in South Vietnam were expected to comply with local laws involving traffic, curfew, off-limits areas, and currency. That sounds like a sentence from a legal guide, because it was, but the reality behind it was immediate. If South Vietnamese authorities imposed a curfew in Saigon, Americans did not simply shrug and wander through the streets because they wore US uniforms. If a city district, a village, or a business was declared off-limits, the order applied unless a soldier had official reasons and proper authorization. If a command wanted men kept out of a place because of security concerns, local hostility, crime, disease, or the risk of incidents with civilians, it had the power to fence off that place without building a single physical fence. The prohibition itself became the barrier. Picture Saigon after the Tet Offensive. In late January 1968, coordinated attacks struck cities, towns, and military targets across South Vietnam. The capital became a place of roadblocks, damaged buildings, emergency meetings, rumours, and sudden uncertainty. President Nguyen Van Thieu declared martial law on January 31st. In the weeks afterward, the curfew in Saigon became part of the city's attempt to regain control. One American diplomatic report in March noted that the curfew had been cut by 2 hours, and that this easing improved morale while the port and city life slowly recovered. That detail is revealing. A curfew was not just a security measure measured in clock time. It shaped how people felt. It affected business, social life, work, transportation, and the small psychological comfort of being able to move through one's own city after dark. For American troops stationed in or near Saigon, curfew meant the city's nightlife could narrow or disappear almost overnight. The clubs, restaurants, streets, and crowded intersections that seemed available one week could become inaccessible the next, not because they had moved, but because the war had altered the permissible hours of presence. And there was a reason commanders cared so much about nighttime movement. Night in Vietnam carried its own reputation. Roads that seemed ordinary by daylight could become uncertain after dark. Checkpoints took on greater importance. Identification mattered more. A vehicle moving at the wrong hour could be questioned, delayed, or treated with suspicion. The danger was not merely theoretical. The Tet attacks had shown that enemy forces could infiltrate urban spaces, strike unexpectedly, and use the confusion of cities to their advantage. The movement of civilians, soldiers, police, local defence forces, and armed infiltrators all had to be sorted under pressure, often with imperfect information. Curfews helped reduce the number of bodies on the street and therefore the number of uncertainties that had to be managed. But for the individual soldier, the strategic explanation often collapsed into a simpler reality. You were told to be in by a certain hour. If you were not, you had a problem. Some restrictions were temporary, tied to immediate emergencies. Others were built into the way American forces were placed inside South Vietnam from the beginning. When General William Westmoreland discussed the establishment of a large US base near My Tho in the Mekong Delta, he emphasized that the troops would be located several miles from the city, that My Tho itself would be off limits to US troops, and that travel through the city would be sharply restricted. The base, later known as Dong Tam, was intended to be self-sufficient, and therefore to place as little strain as possible on local resources. This is a crucial point. Restrictions on movement were not always about punishing soldiers or keeping them from pleasure. Sometimes they were about controlling the social and economic footprint of a massive foreign military force. Thousands of Americans moving freely through a nearby Vietnamese city could overwhelm local businesses, aggravate resentment, increase traffic incidents, and bring conflicts that commanders preferred to avoid before they started. So the solution was geographic discipline. Build the base outside the city, keep the city off limits, allow only necessary travel, let the soldiers live near My Tho without truly becoming part of My Tho's daily life. That arrangement tells us something about how American presence was experienced by Vietnamese civilians as well. An American soldier might see an off-limits order as one more irritation imposed from above. A resident of a Vietnamese city might see the same order as relief. It could mean fewer military vehicles in crowded streets, fewer drunken servicemen pouring into bars, fewer arguments in markets, fewer collisions, fewer moments when local life had to bend around the appetites and impatience of foreign troops. We should be careful not to romanticize this. Off-limits orders did not erase friction. They did not solve the deeper political problem of a powerful foreign army operating across South Vietnam. But they show that commanders knew unrestricted movement could create resentment, and that movement control was one tool, however imperfect, for managing that resentment. The wire around a base was security infrastructure, but it was also a social boundary. The Marine experience around Da Nang gives us another revealing example. By 1970, Da Nang and most other cities and villages in Quang Nam had been declared off-limits to US military personnel except those on official business with written passes from their unit commanders or division staff heads. This was not a casual suggestion. It was a formal restriction that shaped where Marines could go when they were not on duty. Only on April 25, 1971 did the 24th Corps declare Da Nang City on limits, again for off-duty American servicemen, and even then the larger atmosphere remained tense. The official marine history describes continuing anti-American feeling in Da Nang and Quang Nam during this period, along with concern that incidents involving Marines could lead to overreaction and serious consequences. That history helps explain why access to the city had been so tightly controlled. Movement was not only about the soldiers' desire for recreation, it was about the command's fear that interactions between tired, armed, sometimes reckless Americans and increasingly frustrated local populations could ignite into something much harder to contain. Now, stop for a moment and consider the oddness of that life. A Marine could spend his days in a province, patrol its roads, defend installations around its city, perhaps fight and bleed within sight of its neighbourhoods, and still be told that he was not free to visit that same city in his off-duty hours. He could be close enough to see signs, rooftops, temples, market awnings, and the movement of civilian life, yet legally separated from it by written passes and posted orders. There is something quietly disorienting about that. The war brought men across the Pacific into a country they had never seen, then often narrowed their experience of that country to military zones, convoy routes, controlled compounds, and brief, authorized windows of contact. They were sent to Vietnam, but not always permitted to wander through Vietnam. Passes mattered because they turned movement into permission. Without a written pass, a place could remain inaccessible no matter how close it was. With one, the same road suddenly opened. A pass converted a forbidden trip into an official one. It made the difference between a soldier conducting duty and a soldier violating an order. In Quang Nam, the restriction was explicit. Official business with written passes from unit commanders or higher staff officials. That requirement tells us how carefully movement was being filtered. The command did not simply say, "Be careful in town." It created a paper gate before the physical gate. The soldier's intention had to be documented before his body could proceed. This was bureaucracy, yes, but bureaucracy with a very practical purpose. In a war zone, knowing who had gone where, under whose authority, and for what reason could matter when an incident occurred, when a patrol was delayed, when rumours spread, or when a man failed to return. Curfews and off-limits orders also changed the economy of leisure. A soldier's leave from combat did not always mean access to the civilian spaces he imagined. Clubs inside military installations became more important when movement outside was restricted. Post exchanges, recreation centres, enlisted clubs, movie nights, card games, taped music, and improvised social life inside the wire took on greater weight because the outside world was not reliably available. This was especially true in rear areas where commanders were trying to manage morale without allowing discipline to fray. In 1969, after rising concern over fragging assaults and broader disorder within the 3rd Marine Division, Major General William K. Jones ordered all division. Clubs closed at 21:30 and imposed a 2200 curfew in rear areas. That detail is startling because it reminds us that curfew was not only a response to enemy threats outside the base. It could also be used to regain command control inside the American force itself. Too many men loose too late at night, too much anger, too much drinking, too many grievances in circulation, and commanders concluded that movement had to contract. Shut the clubs earlier, order men back to quarters, reduce the number of opportunities for trouble. This is where forbidden movement begins to mean more than checkpoints and city streets. Movement itself was treated as a variable in discipline. When commanders feared disorder, they limited it. When investigations followed violence, they froze it. The Marine legal history describes procedures after serious incidents such as racial clashes or fragging assaults. Military police teams isolated the area, controlled movement in and out, conducted roll calls, and suspended transient movement including R&R departures, temporary duty departures, and even permanent change of station departures to the United States for the duration of the investigation. Sergeants and below could be ordered to remain in their tents or huts. with food delivered because no movement was permitted until the inquiry concluded. This is the military version of a room suddenly locking around everyone inside it. A man might believe he was leaving for rest and recreation the next morning, or even preparing to rotate home, and then an incident somewhere nearby could halt the movement of dozens or hundreds of people at once. The war had many doors, but command retained the right to close them. That sort of restriction could feel deeply unfair to men who had done nothing wrong. One person commits violence, and everyone around him loses movement. One assault occurs, and men who had been counting days until departure find themselves stuck. Yet the logic from command's perspective was easy to follow. If witnesses might disappear, if suspects might scatter, if anger might erupt again, then controlling movement became part of controlling the truth. The military police did not only patrol streets or guard gates, they managed human flow. They decided who passed and who waited. They helped convert an unstable area into a contained one, long enough for investigators and commanders to figure out what had happened. In ordinary civilian life, we associate freedom with movement so strongly that being told to stay in one place immediately feels punitive. In wartime military life, staying put could be an investigative tool, a security practice, and a reminder that the individual body belonged partly to the institution. There were also reasons commanders tried to regulate travel involving vehicles, not just walking. Marine records from 1970 and early 1971 describe motor vehicle accidents as a serious source of antagonism between American servicemen and Vietnamese civilians. The official history noted that accidents involving unauthorized drivers, alcohol, unauthorized runs, and misused vehicles had become a major non-combat concern. In the first 9 months of 1970, the 1st Marine Division alone reportedly lost 3 Marines killed and 85 injured in traffic mishaps, while the same accidents left 39 Vietnamese dead and 81 injured. Commanders responded by tightening control over vehicle use and imposing more certain punishment on marine traffic violators. These figures are uncomfortable, but they explain why movement restrictions could expand beyond gate passes and curfews. A jeep on a Vietnamese road was not merely transportation. In the wrong hands, at the wrong speed, after the wrong amount of drinking, it could become a source of death, resentment, and diplomatic trouble. So a soldier was not always free to take a vehicle because one was nearby. He was not always free to leave a compound because he was off duty. He was not always free to enter a city because it existed at the end of a road. And he was not always free to remain out because he felt he had earned one more drink, one more hour, one more conversation. The line between military necessity and personal frustration ran through all of this. A curfew could protect. It could also irritate. An off-limits order could prevent a deadly incident. It could also make a soldier feel like a prisoner within his own camp. A pass requirement could preserve accountability. It could also make the simplest errand feel like an administrative campaign. The Vietnam War was full of large arguments about strategy and legitimacy, but for the individual serviceman, authority often arrived in smaller forms: a gate guard saying no, an MP checking papers, a posted notice on a club door, a commander announcing that liberty hours had changed. The phrase, "beyond the wire," carries a certain romance in war stories. It suggests danger, uncertainty, territory beyond ordinary control. But in Vietnam, the world beyond the wire was not merely dangerous, it was regulated. There were spaces a soldier could enter only in convoy, spaces he could enter only with paperwork, spaces he could enter only on duty, and spaces he could not enter at all. The existence of a road did not create a right to travel it. The existence of a town did not create a right to visit it. The existence of free hours did not create actual freedom. Commanders knew that troops carried American power with them wherever they went, even when they were merely looking for a cold drink or a few hours away from the unit. Because of that, movement was never entirely private. It had political consequences, military consequences, and sometimes deadly ones. Let us return for a moment to the young soldier who imagined the evening might belong to him. He has washed his face from a metal basin. He has found a clean shirt, or at least a less dirty one. He has heard that a few men are heading toward town, but then someone says the area is still off limits. Another man claims there is a way around it, though no one seems eager to test that story. There is a notice posted near the club. Closing time has changed again. Curfew comes earlier than he hoped. Maybe MPS have been especially active since some trouble last week. Maybe the company commander has warned everyone there will be no excuses for being outside after hours. Maybe he folds the idea away and returns to a bunk, annoyed but not surprised. By now he understands that a soldier in Vietnam could be ordered into the field with little warning, but could not always choose the street at the end of his own free evening. That contradiction was part of the war's daily texture. Great mobility under command, limited mobility by personal choice. And there is still another restriction waiting just ahead. One that began once a soldier found himself beyond the wire, beyond the curfew, beyond the pass desk, out in the places where war left objects behind. Because movement was not the only thing the army tried to control. What a man picked up, carried back, mailed home, traded, displayed, or kept as proof that he had been there could also become forbidden. The battlefield produced souvenirs, and the military did not consider all of them harmless. That problem began with a very simple human urge, to keep something, to bring back a piece of the place that had taken so much from you. A helmet pulled from the mud, a belt buckle, a flag, a pistol, a strange-looking rifle with unfamiliar markings, something that could sit on a shelf years later and silently prove that you had really been there, that the war had not been a fever dream of heat, noise, fear, and exhaustion. Soldiers have carried souvenirs home from wars for as long as wars have been fought. Sometimes those objects were harmless. Sometimes they became family heirlooms. Sometimes they were displayed with pride, wrapped in stories that grew more polished with every retelling. But in Vietnam, the battlefield was not treated as an open-air gift shop, and the American military did not recognize every object a soldier wanted as his to keep. A man could walk through a captured bunker and see plenty of things that looked portable, interesting, even irresistible, yet still be forbidden to claim them. The rule was not that no souvenir of any kind could ever leave Southeast Asia. The rule was that personal desire did not decide ownership. Command did, regulation did, customs did, and in some cases the laws of war did. What looked to a young soldier like a trophy might legally be US government property, intelligence material, dangerous contraband, stolen civilian property, or evidence of a crime. The war left objects everywhere. The army spent a surprising amount of effort telling men which of those objects they were not allowed to make their own. This may be harder for us to appreciate now because the word souvenir sounds so innocent. It calls to mind a postcard, a snow globe, a cheap t-shirt from a roadside shop. In war, the word has always carried more weight. A captured enemy weapon was not merely decorative, it might have intelligence value. It might be needed for technical analysis. It might still be loaded, damaged, booby-trapped, or illegal under American firearms law. A map, radio, code sheet, or unusual piece of equipment might be far more valuable to an intelligence officer than it would ever be in a soldier's footlocker. A wallet taken from a dead man was not a memento. It was personal property, and keeping it was theft. A gold ring, a watch, a photograph, a religious item, or a family keepsake taken from a civilian home did not become fair game because nearby shots had been fired earlier that day. The US Army's law of war teaching made the distinction brutally clear. Pillage, looting, purposeless destruction, mutilation of dead bodies, and the taking of a captured enemy soldier's personal property as a war trophy were all treated as prohibited acts. The line between a lawful military trophy and an unlawful personal taking was not vague in principle, even if individuals sometimes pretended not to see it. By the late 1960s, the Department of Defense had put these matters into formal joint regulation. On August 28, 1969, The Army, Navy, Air Force and Marine Corps issued a revised policy titled Control and Registration of War Trophies and War Trophy Firearms. It was a complete revision of a 1965 regulation, and it tells us a great deal about what commanders believed needed to be controlled. The document defined a war trophy as an item of enemy public or private property used as war material, acquired in a combat area or combat zone during an authorised period, and approved by command for retention. That definition alone removed a great deal from the soldier's personal judgment. He could not simply say, "I found it, therefore it is mine." A captured object did not become a lawful trophy by touch. It became one only through authorization. The regulation treated enemy material as something entering a chain of control, not a casual personal prize. And if that sounds bureaucratic, it was. But bureaucracy in this case was the military's way of saying that the battlefield belonged to the mission before it belonged to memory. The prohibited list was longer than many soldiers probably expected. US property could not be claimed. Property belonging to Allied nations could not be claimed. American property issued to foreign governments and then captured from enemy forces could not be casually pocketed. Nameplates could not be removed from captured equipment unless authorized. Live ammunition, explosives, or any item containing explosives were barred. Certain firearms prohibited under the National Firearms Act were barred. Electronic equipment such as radios and radar components were barred. Flammables were barred. Enemy-owned equipment not designed for individual use, including motor vehicles, aircraft, motorcycles, machine tools, and surgical or dental instruments was barred. Household goods, art objects, stamps, coin collections, gems, jewellery, paintings, and items of historical or artistic value were barred. So were things considered more useful for research, training, military intelligence, or technical study than as trophies. The regulation even included a broad category for any article major commanders considered potentially harmful to the health, safety, or welfare of individuals. In other words, the list did not merely say no grenades in duffel bags, although it certainly said that. It said no to a whole range of battlefield temptations, from dangerous weapons to valuable cultural property to equipment that might help analysts understand how the enemy fought. This is the part where the imagined scene becomes almost obvious. A patrol comes across an abandoned cache, rifles stacked in a trench, ammunition crates, perhaps a Chinese-made carbine, a Soviet block rifle, a homemade pistol, or some unusual piece of enemy equipment no one in the unit has seen before. For a young soldier, the object may feel electric. It is proof of contact with the other side. It is tangible. It has weight. It is not like a memory, which can blur, or a photograph which can be lost. A weapon can be held, cleaned, displayed, explained. But that exact quality made it something commanders wanted controlled. Captured weapons had to be inventoried, reported, examined, and in some cases turned over. The regulation allowed certain war trophy firearms to be retained, but only through a process. It required authorization, documentation, and registration. Even lawful trophies were not treated as spontaneous keepsakes. They were treated as exceptions requiring paperwork. The paperwork itself is strangely revealing. The 1969 regulation included DD Form 603-1, a war trophy registration and authorization document. It asked for the owner's name, service number, rank, organisation, home address, theatre and period of overseas service, description of the trophy, serial number or identifying mark, and the signature of an authenticating officer. If the object was a firearm, additional registration was required. This is not how one treats a casual trinket. This is how one treats an object that could become legally troublesome the moment it crossed an ocean. The military wanted a paper trail showing who had it, what it was, where it came from, and who had approved it. A trophy without documentation could become contraband. A weapon without proper authorization could be seized. The fact that all of this was written into a formal joint regulation tells us that trophy taking was not a rare curiosity at the edge of the war. It was common enough, and risky enough to demand a government process. Vietnam's specific practice confirms that this was not just a regulation sitting unread in Washington. A Marine Advisory Departure checklist from the war included a step instructing personnel who possessed a war trophy souvenir weapon to take it to naval intelligence authorities for a registration certificate and then to the Provost Marshal for customs clearance forms. That small administrative note tells you exactly how the rule entered real life. A Marine preparing to rotate out of Vietnam might be thinking about flight dates, final reports, pay records, medical files, and the impossible feeling of leaving a war while others remained in it. Alongside all of that, there could be a captured weapon to process through official channels, not hidden under shirts in a duffel bag, not slipped quietly into baggage, registered, cleared, accounted for. The object had to pass through authority before it could accompany him home. Even when authorization existed, there were sharp limits on how items could travel. The 1969 regulation stated that war trophy firearms could not be mailed or shipped to the United States. They could be personally transported or carried in accompanied baggage, but only within applicable carrier regulations and restrictions set by major overseas commanders. Other authorized trophies could be mailed, shipped, or carried, but still only as prescribed by command. Articles unlawfully shipped or carried into the United States were subject to seizure by customs, military authorities, or other agencies. Captured enemy property, including war trophy firearms, was declared to be the property of the United States as captor and therefore subject to recovery by the government. That sentence is worth slowing down over. The soldier may have found the item. He may have risked his life in the operation that produced it. He may have already imagined where it would hang in his parents' den or sit on a table in a future apartment. But legally, until authorized otherwise, it did not belong to him. It belonged to the United States. This is where the word contraband enters the story, in a more literal sense. A weapon carried home without authorization was not simply an unauthorized souvenir. It could become seized property. Captured enemy army, naval or aerospace material taken unlawfully could be treated as contraband and routed to designated military facilities or technical offices. The regulation laid out what was supposed to happen when such material was found, which means officials anticipated that some people would attempt to move it outside approved channels. That possibility existed because war creates a peculiar relationship with objects. A soldier who has spent months watching friends wounded by enemy fire may look at a captured rifle as something more than property. It may feel like proof of survival. It may feel earned. It may feel like a private answer to a public experience no one at home will fully understand. Regulations had to confront not merely theft, but attachment. They had to say no even when the object carried emotion, not all forbidden. Items were weapons, some were valuables, and here the ethical boundary was clearer still. The 1969 regulation prohibited keeping household property, art, jewellery, paintings, stamp collections, coin collections, and other objects of worth or historical value as war trophies. The Army's Law of War instruction went further, warning that taking and keeping a captured enemy soldier's personal property, such as a wallet or watch, was a war crime, not a harmless battlefield custom. It also stated that valuables of dead soldiers had to be collected, safeguarded, and sent through proper channels, not pocketed. That is an important distinction because the battlefield can make theft feel almost invisible. The owner may be dead, the house may be abandoned, the object may be small enough to disappear into a pouch. No one back home may ever ask where it came from. But the law did not treat invisibility as innocence. It treated personal property as personal property, even in war, and especially when the owner could no longer defend it. Then there were trophies so grotesque that even calling them souvenirs feels wrong. The Army's Law of War teaching explicitly identified mutilation of dead bodies, including cutting off ears, as a war crime. It also said that in order to cut ears from enemy dead to prove a body count would itself be criminal, and that permission to take valuables from dead bodies or prisoners could not make the act lawful. Those examples were not chosen at random. They reflected the kinds of violations commanders wanted soldiers to understand clearly and reject absolutely. A body was not a battlefield object to be altered for proof, revenge, intimidation, or macabre keepsake. The dead were not exempt from rules simply because they could no longer speak. Even in a war that dehumanized both sides with terrifying ease, official doctrine insisted that there were boundaries around the treatment of remains. This subject is uncomfortable, but it belongs here because the temptation to turn the enemy into a token is one of the darkest forms trophy-taking can assume. A rifle is an object before it enters war. A patch is an object. A helmet is an object. A human body is not. And yet wars have repeatedly produced men who cross that line, men who imagine that victory gives them possession not only of equipment, but of the dead themselves. Vietnam was not exempt from that history. The military's own teaching and legal guidance show that commanders felt the need to state the prohibition plainly. The fact that it had to be said plainly tells us something painful about what war can awaken in people when anger, grief, racism, fear, and group approval begin reinforcing one another. A soldier was not allowed to cut, keep, trade, display, or carry home parts of a dead enemy as if they were battlefield relics. That was not folklore. That was prohibited conduct. There is a quieter side to this story too, because many soldiers did want ordinary reminders that did not cross legal or moral lines. A lighter bought in country, a photograph, a locally made bracelet, a unit patch traded with another American, a piece of paper, a map copy, a scrap of notation, sometimes even an authorized trophy that had passed through the proper process. The regulation against unauthorized trophies did not erase the need to remember. It simply tried to prevent memory from becoming theft, danger, or desecration. That distinction matters. Soldiers in Vietnam were living through experiences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. It is not surprising that some wanted something tangible to anchor those experiences. But the military view was that memory did not automatically outrank law. The right to remember did not create a right to smuggle ammunition, conceal enemy weapons, strip valuables from the dead, or loot homes under the cover of war. The regulations also reveal the strange way a war can turn objects into competing claims. A captured radio might seem like a prize to the soldier who discovered it, but to intelligence officers it might explain enemy communications. A machine component might appear worthless to a rifleman and valuable to technical specialists. A foreign weapon might look like a perfect trophy, but if it fell under restricted categories or lacked authorization, it could not lawfully become personal property. Even art, coins, or antiques, items with no immediate tactical use, could not be swept up under the loose excuse of combat. The battlefield may have seemed chaotic, but command tried to impose a sorting system. Things to study, things to destroy safely, things to return, things to document, things never to touch, and only then, in certain cases, things a soldier might keep. Let me ask you to imagine a moment near the end of a tour. A soldier sits on the floor beside an open duffel bag. Around him are the small remains of a year he does not yet know how to explain. Letters tied together, photographs curled at the edges, a paperback swollen from humidity, a shirt with faded sweat marks, maybe a hand-carved trinket bought from a vendor, maybe a patch, maybe an object he is not supposed to have. Perhaps he tells himself it is nothing. Perhaps he knows exactly what it is. Perhaps he thinks no one will care. Perhaps someone has already warned him that inspections happen and unauthorized items can be taken. This is what rules against contraband did at the personal level. They moved the war from rice paddies and bunkers into the private space of a man's baggage. They asked him, at the very moment he was preparing to leave, whether he would still obey a line drawn months earlier by people he would never meet. A rule about trophies could feel distant during combat. It became immediate when the bag was being packed. There is something revealing in the military's determination to control what left Vietnam. Wars do not end cleanly for those who fight them. They travel home in memories, injuries, nightmares, photographs, jokes no one else understands, and sometimes in objects. The government could not regulate memory. It could not inspect a man's dreams. It could not confiscate grief. But it could inspect baggage. It could seize contraband. It could require forms. It could say that some pieces of the war were not yours to carry away, no matter how much you wanted them. In that sense, the rule against unauthorized trophies was not merely about property. It was about the army insisting that participation in violence did not grant a soldier private ownership over whatever violence left behind. And once that lesson settled in, the next boundary became even more complicated, because objects were easier to regulate than relationships. A weapon could be recorded on a form, a painting could be seized, ammunition could be counted. But people were not so simple. American soldiers lived among Vietnamese civilians, worked around them, relied on them, feared them, pitied them, desired them, distrusted them, and in some cases formed attachments the military wanted tightly controlled. The next set of prohibitions had less to do with what a man carried home, and more to do with how close he was allowed to get to the people whose country had become the setting of his war. Relationships were harder to regulate than objects. A rifle could be tagged, recorded, and turned in. A crate of ammunition could be counted. A captured flag could be inspected before it ever reached a duffel bag. But a conversation could not be inventoried so easily. A smile exchanged in a market, an argument at a roadside stall, a house entered during a search, a child handed a piece of candy, a woman spoken to too boldly, a family whose wall was broken by a vehicle, a soldier who began visiting the same cafe every time he had leave. These things lived in a less orderly space, and yet the American military tried to regulate them too, because the Vietnam War was not fought across empty land. It was fought in a country filled with villages, farms, roads, temples, markets, homes and families. US forces operated in places where enemy contact and civilian life often occupied the same ground, and that meant an American soldier could not move through the population as though it were merely scenery behind the war. His conduct toward civilians was not treated as a private matter. It was part of the war itself. This is why one of the most revealing documents of the entire conflict was not a battle map or a classified intelligence report, but a small conduct card issued to American personnel in Vietnam. General William Westmoreland directed that the 9 rules of conduct be provided to officers and soldiers so they would have a ready guide for dealing with Vietnamese people. The card did not instruct them to remain cold, distant, or suspicious of everyone around them. Quite the opposite. It told them to remember that they were guests, to make no demands and seek no special treatment, to understand Vietnamese life, to use phrases from the language, to honour local customs and laws, to treat women with politeness and respect, to make friends among soldiers and ordinary people, to give Vietnamese civilians the right of way, to avoid loud or rude behaviour, and to avoid separating themselves from the population by flaunting wealth or privilege. It was a short list, but it says a great deal about what commanders feared. They feared arrogance. They feared American impatience. They feared that men with money, weapons, and official backing might act as though Vietnamese civilians existed beneath them. They also feared the political cost of that behaviour. That card is worth sitting with because it complicates the idea of distance from civilians. The military did not want total separation. It wanted controlled closeness. It wanted soldiers to appear respectful, approachable and disciplined, not isolated and hostile. The instruction to make personal friends among the people would sound strange if American policy had been simple avoidance. But that friendliness came with boundaries. Friendship was supposed to support goodwill, not turn into exploitation. Courtesy was expected, but familiarity was not meant to dissolve command judgment. Soldiers were encouraged to show warmth without assuming entitlement. They were warned not to make demands, because even small demands could become acts of domination, when one side carried a rifle and the other did not. The message was practical as much as moral. In a counterinsurgency, the way a soldier behaved in front of a shopkeeper or a farmer could matter to the larger war effort. A man could not win over a population one moment and insult it the next. Taken together, the card suggests that commanders understood civilian conduct as a strategic matter, not just a matter of good manners. The problem, of course, was that the actual war did not always allow civilian contact to remain calm and orderly. Soldiers moved through hamlets where they might have been told the Viet Cong had passed only hours before. They searched places where weapons could be hidden under floorboards or in haystacks. They walked roads lined with homes while knowing that mines might be buried nearby. The Army's own Vietnam interview material noted that because large numbers of civilians lived in areas where enemy contact began, artillery units often had to obtain mandatory clearances and checks before fire missions could proceed. That detail reveals a wider truth. Civilians were not an afterthought. Their presence altered the way force could legally and practically be used. A soldier might be frightened, angry, or convinced that danger was close, but he was not permitted to treat every civilian space as a free fire zone. The surrounding population imposed limits on operations, sometimes slowing action, sometimes frustrating troops, but always reminding them that they were fighting among people who were not automatically the enemy. The 9 Rules card addressed the ordinary face of that reality. Do not shout unnecessarily. Do not behave in ways that draw hostile attention. Do not push past civilians in the road as though American urgency outweighs Vietnamese dignity. Do not parade possessions or status in front of people living with wartime scarcity. These may sound like small instructions, but small acts accumulate. A convoy tearing through a crowded village, a soldier tossing money carelessly, a drunken insult in a shop, a hand placed where it should not be, each could feed resentment. The card existed because American commanders believed goodwill could be damaged not only by large military decisions, but by daily personal conduct. The soldier was being told, in effect, that he could not behave like a conqueror, even if he sometimes felt all the privileges of one. Women occupied a particularly sensitive place in these rules. The card's instruction to treat women with politeness and respect was short, but it did not stand alone. The broader military system also tried to regulate romantic and marital relationships with women in Asia, especially when those relationships moved beyond fleeting contact. Marine Corps legal history from Vietnam records that requests to marry Vietnamese women became common enough that legal assistance lawyers served on marriage counselling boards. According to that account, Division Order 1752.1 required the commanding general's written permission before a Marine outside the United States could marry. The process included counselling by a chaplain and a judge advocate, along with background documentation on the prospective bride. Marine lawyer W. Hayes Parks recalled that local authorities were not authorised to issue marriage licenses to Marines without the commanding general's written permission, which in practice was rarely granted during a Vietnam tour. He said that, to his knowledge, only one Marine succeeded in navigating the entire process during that period, and that case involved a major who had known the woman long before arriving in Vietnam. This does not mean soldiers were forbidden to feel affection, or that every cross-cultural relationship was regarded as misconduct. The reality was more complicated than that. What the record shows is that the military did not treat marriage to a Vietnamese woman as a purely personal decision. It became an administrative, legal and diplomatic matter. The same Marine history notes that if a background check identified a prospective bride as a prostitute, immigration to the United States would be precluded, raising further legal problems. Officials also worried about men making impulsive promises during R&R, then changing their minds after returning home, leaving women stranded and governments embarrassed. There is something revealing in that bureaucracy. The institution that could send a 19-year-old into combat with a rifle still insisted that he could not simply marry abroad because he had fallen in love during a few intense weeks. The military viewed these relationships through a lens of responsibility, reputation, and control. Sexual contact with civilians created another layer of concern, one that the army framed partly as a public health crisis. The Army Medical Department's official history of venereal disease in Vietnam reported an average incidence of 261.9 cases per 1,000 strength per year from 1963 to 1970, and it stated that venereal disease was the number one diagnosis among Army personnel from 1965 through the end of the war. The same history explained that the military's control program rested on education, prophylaxis, detection, early treatment, and suppression of prostitution. That wording matters. The Army did not treat sexual commerce around American bases as a harmless side effect of deployment. It treated it as a threat to readiness and health that required organised countermeasures. Soldiers received briefings when they arrived, further instruction at their units, and additional briefings before R&R or leave. Yet infection rates remained high, especially in areas near large cities and troop concentrations. The official history concluded that education alone often failed to change behaviour. That medical record tells us something important about conduct towards civilians. The military did not always succeed in restraining the contacts it worried about, but it plainly believed they required management. Sexual relationships, commercial or otherwise, were not sealed off from military discipline simply because they occurred during off-duty hours. They affected health, morale, local economies, and relations with the surrounding population. They contributed to the sense that large American troop concentrations altered civilian life in ways commanders could not fully control. A soldier who viewed local women only through the careless language of barracks talk might think his choices belonged only to him. The Army's medical and legal systems suggest otherwise. His choices were being counted in clinic records, discussed in policy documents, and folded into larger concerns about order in a foreign country. Property damage created similar problems. US military operations in South Vietnam inevitably affected civilian homes, fields, vehicles, and animals, and the American command developed claims procedures to deal with losses attributed to US forces. Army histories note that claims arising from use, occupancy, or damage during and after military operations were handled by the US Army Vietnam Foreign Claims Division. Marine operational history likewise describes G5 and S5, civil affairs officers settling civilian damage claims against Marines, and helping coordinate operations in populated areas with South Vietnamese government and pacification officials. These systems did not erase civilian suffering, and they did not always satisfy the people making claims, but their existence tells us that the military recognised a line between fighting a war and assuming civilians had no right to compensation when American actions destroyed or damaged what they owned. A soldier could not simply decide that a cracked wall, a crushed bicycle, or a dead water buffalo did not matter, because the war was larger than one family's loss. The command itself had created channels for such grievances. This is where the distance between civilians and soldiers becomes most complicated. American troops needed information from the population. They sometimes relied on interpreters, local guides, labourers, clerks, cooks, laundresses, drivers, and allied Vietnamese soldiers. They were told to build rapport, but they were also warned not to abuse the uneven power between themselves and the people around them. The line could be crossed in many ways. It could be crossed through theft, through unnecessary humiliation, through violence, through sexual exploitation, through reckless driving, or through the assumption that local property and local patience were endless. The conduct card tried to warn against some of this at the level of everyday behaviour. Legal systems and claims offices dealt with it after harm occurred. The two together reveal that civilian contact was never truly casual in Vietnam. It was part of the war's pressure system. When conduct crossed into criminal violence, the rules grew much harsher. Marine Corps legal history explains that violations of the law of war committed by Marines against Vietnamese people were charged under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The murder of a civilian non-combatant, for example, was charged as murder under Article 118. Another official Marine source notes that Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Directive 20-4 defined a war crime as every violation of the law of war and treated willful killing outside combat as a grave breach. This matters because it shows that civilians were not merely protected by soft guidance cards or polite recommendations. Their lives were protected, at least in law, by criminal prohibitions. A soldier who deliberately killed a non-combatant was not committing a regrettable breach of etiquette. He was committing a crime. That legal clarity did not mean enforcement was always perfect, and the Vietnam War offers painful evidence that it was not. But for this part of the story, the essential point is that official policy did not permit soldiers to treat civilians as targets merely because they lived in a dangerous area, or because enemy forces blended into the population. The challenge of distinguishing combatant from non-combatant was real. The frustration soldiers felt was real. The risk of ambush was real. Yet none of those facts created a general license to brutalize civilians. The presence of guidance cards, mandatory fire clearances in populated areas, claim systems, and courts-martial for crimes against non-combatants all point toward the same official standard. Civilians were to be dealt with carefully, and American soldiers were not supposed to turn fear into permission. Now picture a village road in the late afternoon. A patrol has slowed near a cluster of homes. Chickens scatter through the dust. A woman stands near a doorway, watching silently. A small boy peers from behind her shoulder. An old man sits beside a fence, expression unreadable. The soldiers are tired, hot, and suspicious because the war has trained them to notice too much. At the same time, somewhere in a pocket, there may be a card telling them they are guests, that they should avoid demands, that women deserve respect, that the people should not be shoved aside or treated as beneath notice. The distance between that card and the moment is enormous. The card is calm. The moment is tense. The card imagines courtesy. The moment contains weapons. Still, the rule remains. The soldier is not free to act as though tension has erased the humanity of the people in front of him. There is something especially difficult about these restrictions because they asked men to maintain restraint in the very environment most likely to strain it. A soldier who had just lost a friend might still be expected to speak respectfully to villagers. A Marine who felt lonely and impulsive might still be told that marriage required approval, no matter how intense the relationship seemed. A young man with cash in his pocket might still be warned not to separate himself from the population through displays of privilege. A driver who thought a road belonged to military vehicles still faced consequences if Vietnamese civilians were harmed. A unit operating near families and homes still had to account for property damage. The rules did not assume soldiers would naturally do all of this. They existed because commanders knew they might not. And that may be the most revealing thing of all. The military's civilian conduct rules did not emerge because contact between Americans and Vietnamese was rare. They emerged because it was constant. Every day of the war brought small points of contact that could either soften or harden the relationship between troops and the people around them. A greeting, a purchase, a misunderstanding, a search, a flirtation, a traffic accident, a favour, an insult, a ruined fence, a marriage request, a medical diagnosis. None of these moments by itself explains the Vietnam War, but together they show the war at human range. They show why American commanders tried to regulate not only gunfire and movement, but contact itself. They wanted soldiers close enough to build trust, disciplined enough not to abuse it, and cautious enough not to forget that the people around them were living inside the war rather than visiting it. That did not make Vietnam gentle. It did not make civilian life safe. It did not guarantee that rules would be followed. But it does tell us what soldiers were officially not allowed to do. They were not supposed to act like overlords in someone else's country. They were not supposed to make demands, flaunt wealth, insult civilians, or treat women carelessly. They were not supposed to reduce relationships to impulsive decisions without consequence. They were not supposed to ignore the cost of damage done to homes and livelihoods. And when contact crossed into violence against non-combatants, the military code was clear that this was no minor lapse. It was punishable criminal conduct. These boundaries formed a kind of uneasy fence around everyday life in Vietnam, a fence meant to preserve discipline, limit resentment, and protect civilians in a war that constantly put civilians in danger. Yet there was another area where the military fought to hold its own lines, and this time the danger was not only outside the wire or among civilians, it was inside the compounds, inside the barracks, inside the clubs, inside the exhausted private hours after duty. Boredom, alcohol, drugs, gambling, racial tension, and resentment of authority all pressed against discipline in ways commanders could not ignore. The war did not stop when a soldier stepped away from a village road. Sometimes the hardest boundaries to maintain were waiting for him back where he slept. The last restrictions waiting for a soldier in Vietnam were not always posted at a city gate or printed on a travel pass. They lived much closer than that. They lived in the barracks, in the enlisted clubs, beside the cot where a man kept his boots, in the pocket where he might hide a packet of heroin, in the argument that grew too loud after drinking, in the resentment toward an officer who sent a squad back into danger, in the exhausted silence of men who had been together too long and trusted one another too little. By the later years of the war, American commanders were no longer worried only about what their troops might do in Vietnamese streets or villages. They were increasingly worried about what might happen inside the American military itself. The war had lasted longer than many men believed it should. Tours continued. Public support at home had weakened. Casualties had accumulated. The purpose of the conflict felt less certain to many of the people being asked to fight it, and in that climate, rules against vice, insubordination, violence, and internal disorder became more urgent than ever. The soldier in Vietnam was not allowed to escape the war by numbing himself however he pleased, not allowed to attack the chain of command because he hated where it sent him, not allowed to turn racial grievance into open warfare inside a unit, and not allowed to abandon military life simply because the institution had begun to feel unbearable. The war might seem endless. Discipline was still expected to hold. Let us begin with the easiest temptation to understand: intoxication. Military service has always had a complicated relationship with alcohol, and Vietnam was no exception. Men drank in clubs, on bases, in rear areas, sometimes to celebrate, sometimes to pass the time, sometimes because the day had been too long and the night ahead seemed too empty. A beer after duty did not automatically mean misconduct, but the military was deeply concerned with what happened when drinking fed fights, reckless driving, absence from duty, abuse of civilians, or disorder inside clubs and billets. In the previous part of this story, we touched on curfews and club closures. That same issue belonged here too, because commanders learned that vice and discipline were linked. In 1969, after rising concern about assaults, fraggings, and broader disorder in marine rear areas, Major General William K. Jones ordered division clubs closed by 9:30 at night and imposed a 10 p.m. curfew in rear areas. That was not a general moral campaign against pleasure. It was a command response to the belief that late-night drinking and loose movement had become part of a larger breakdown in order. The club did not exist outside the war. It had become one of the places where the war's tensions gathered. The real crisis, however, came with drugs. By 1970, official Army medical history states that a wide range of illicit drugs was readily available in Vietnam, including marijuana, amphetamines, and heroin. The drug problem began drawing serious official attention in 1968, and by the summer of 1971, the Army regarded it as an epidemic among soldiers in Vietnam. The availability of heroin especially alarmed military and civilian leaders. It was cheap, potent, and easy to obtain in some areas. Its spread raised fears not only about individual health, but also about combat readiness, unit trust, and what might happen when addicted soldiers rotated home. In June 1971, President Richard Nixon ordered the armed services to conduct heroin testing, a program later expanded to other drugs. This was one of the clearest signs that drug use was no longer being treated as a scattered discipline problem. It had become a military emergency and a national political issue at the same time. For the individual soldier, the prohibition was straightforward, even if enforcement became complicated. He was not allowed to use illegal drugs. The Marine Corps said so bluntly. One official history quotes the Corps' position in 1970 and 1971. Those who experimented with drugs could expect punishment, and those who became addicted would be separated. The Marine Corps initially resisted amnesty programs for drug users until the Department of Defense required such programs across the services. That detail matters because it shows two different instincts competing inside the military. One was punitive. Drug use was misconduct and should be punished. The other was practical. If commanders wanted addicted men to come forward before they became more dangerous to themselves and their units, some path to disclosure and treatment had to exist. Vietnam pushed the armed forces into that uneasy middle ground. A soldier was still forbidden to use heroin, marijuana, or other illegal substances. But by the early 1970s, the scale of the problem forced leaders to admit that punishment alone would not solve it. There is something revealing about the Army's drug education effort. Official medical accounts describe programs meant to teach officers and non-commissioned officers how to speak credibly about drug abuse, because troops often distrusted simple scare tactics. That distrust did not appear out of nowhere. Many soldiers came from a United States where arguments over marijuana, authority, and official truth were already intensifying. Some had heard exaggerated warnings before entering service, and then dismissed later warnings as more of the same. The Army found that convincing young troops about the dangers of drugs was harder when they believed command spokesmen overstated one problem and therefore might be overstating all of them. Vietnam did not create the American drug culture of the era, but it created an environment where that culture met war, boredom, fear, cash, and availability. The result was something commanders struggled to contain. A soldier might tell himself that a few puffs of marijuana in a bunker hurt no one, or that heroin was a temporary escape from a temporary hell. The military saw it differently. Impaired men carried weapons, stood watches, handled vehicles, treated casualties, worked communications, and sometimes entered combat. Their intoxication was never fully private. Now picture a rear area hooch at night. Mosquito netting hangs around bunks. A fan turns weakly overhead if the power is holding. Someone is writing a letter. Someone else is playing cards. A radio is low. Maybe a few men are laughing. Maybe the laughter is too forced. A cigarette passes from hand to hand. One man knows what is mixed into the evening, and another pretends not to. The war can look almost absent in that room, but it is there in the way men are trying to shut it out. The command sees the same room differently. It sees possible impairment, illegal possession, a weakening of readiness, and the start of a discipline problem that may later appear in a patrol, a convoy, a sentry post, or a violent argument. That is why the rule against drugs mattered. It was not only about personal morality, it was about whether a unit could still trust its members to function when the ordinary pressure of military life suddenly turned into danger. Discipline problems did not stop at intoxication. The late Vietnam War also saw a rise in assaults against officers and non-commissioned officers, most notoriously in the form of fragging. The term came from fragmentation grenades, though not every attack involved one. Fragging referred to attacks on superiors by their own men, often motivated by rage, resentment, fear of dangerous leadership, or a belief that certain officers were reckless with enlisted lives. The official Marine legal history states that Marine Corps fragging incidents clearly increased sharply in 1969, while the US Army recorded 126 incidents in 1969, 271 in 1970, and 333 in 1971. These numbers do not mean that every unit was collapsing, or that most soldiers were attacking their leaders. They do mean that the phenomenon had become too significant to dismiss as rumour. It represented one of the most alarming forms of an internal breakdown in the American force. A soldier was forbidden to disobey lawful orders. He was even more plainly forbidden to answer his anger by trying to murder a superior. Fragging is one of those subjects that can be distorted by dramatic retelling, so it is worth handling carefully. It did not emerge because all enlisted men hated all officers. Many relationships between leaders and troops remained respectful, close, and even life-saving. Some officers were loved by their men. Some platoons functioned with remarkable trust under terrible conditions. But in units where morale had deteriorated, where soldiers believed commanders were chasing body counts or unnecessary risks, where tours were nearly over and no one wanted to die for a mission they no longer understood, the threat of retaliation could grow. Official Marine histories describe some strife-torn units in Vietnam where officers faced the daily threat of assassination by their own men. That sentence is severe, and it tells us how far discipline could fray in certain pockets of the force. The chain of command depended on authority, but authority depended partly on legitimacy. When troops came to view a leader as a threat rather than a protector, command entered dangerous territory. Still, none of that made violence lawful. A grenade tossed into a hooch was not protest. It was attempted murder or murder. The fear surrounding fragging changed the atmosphere of military life in ways hard to measure. Officers became more cautious. Some slept uneasily. Some changed routines. Some worried about whether the men under them would obey because they trusted the command or merely because they had not yet chosen open defiance. Judge advocates and commanders treated fragging as a grave assault on the foundation of military order. It was not simply another crime on a list. If troops began threatening or attacking leaders to shape decisions about patrols, discipline or punishment, then command authority itself was under pressure. A soldier could complain that an officer was reckless. He could use legal channels to report wrongdoing. He could request review, write home, grumble among friends, or even despise the man in private. What he could not do was place explosives near that officer's sleeping space, or attack him in the dark because he disliked how the war was being run. The wider discipline crisis included racial conflict as well. The armed forces had been formally integrated before the Vietnam War, but integration did not erase racism, unequal treatment, or the larger conflicts transforming American society in the late 1960s. Official Army material notes that by 1971 the Department of Defense created the Defense Race Relations Institute in response to racial tensions among service members. Official Marine and Army histories likewise describe racial tension as one of the serious problems commanders faced during the withdrawal years of the war. Black troops who entered military service during a period of rising racial consciousness often believed they encountered discrimination inside the armed forces, just as many did in civilian life. White troops, officers, and institutions did not always respond well. The result could be bitter arguments, confrontations, and in some cases serious incidents of unrest. The military did not permit service members to turn racial anger into violence or organised disorder, but commanders could not pretend the tensions did not exist. They had to respond to them while the war was still ongoing. This is important because the boundaries of military life are often described as though they are purely top-down. Orders come from commanders. Soldiers obey. Misconduct is punished. But racial tension showed that discipline also depended on whether men felt they were being treated fairly by the institution that demanded obedience from them. A unit can endure rain, mud, poor food, and endless fatigue more easily than it can endure the belief that some members are valued less than others. By the early 1970s, commanders were contending not only with the enemy, and not only with anti-war sentiment, but with the possibility that the same social conflicts tearing at the United States were being carried into barracks and clubs overseas. The rule remained clear. No soldier was allowed to assault another, riot, threaten, or turn unit spaces into racial battlegrounds. But the official response increasingly had to include more than punishment. Training, equal opportunity efforts, and race relations programs were signs that the services recognised discipline could not be preserved indefinitely by pretending grievances were imaginary. There were also older forms of misconduct that war made harder to control. Theft, black market dealing, currency violations, illegal trade in scarce goods. Official marine legal history noted that civilians in Vietnam continued to commit crimes such as black marketeering and currency violations, and American military authorities faced related problems among those operating in the same environment. Earlier in the war, commanders were already worried about what troops bought, sold, diverted, or smuggled. The supply system of a large expeditionary force inevitably created temptations. Fuel, cigarettes, alcohol, electronics, military equipment, and American goods all had value. A soldier who believed no one would miss a case of supplies or a few exchange vouchers could find himself stepping into misconduct that seemed small at first and then expanded. The military did not consider wartime abundance a private opportunity. Government property remained government property. Currency controls and anti-black market measures existed because the American presence had already distorted local economies enough without troops feeding illegal trade. None of these problems existed in isolation. Drugs, racial conflict, fragging, black market dealing, and ordinary indiscipline fed into one another because they grew from the same unstable environment. By the later years of the war, some official histories describe American forces grappling with disobedience, drug abuse, and racial tensions as US involvement wound down. Marine histories speak of discipline in disarray, and note that lawyers in Vietnam were dealing with drug use, racism, fragging, and the murder of non-combatants alongside the ordinary legal work of a military force. That list is grim, but it captures something essential. The war was not becoming simpler as American forces prepared to leave. In some ways, the internal burden grew heavier. Combat units still had missions. Commanders still had obligations. But the institution was increasingly forced to patrol itself as carefully as it patrolled roads and villages. Consider the moral exhaustion inside that. A commander might spend the day dealing with enemy activity, logistical shortages, redeployment planning, and relations with Vietnamese authorities, then spend the evening reviewing a drug case, a racial incident, a suspected theft, or a threat against an officer. A judge advocate might go from advising on combat operations to handling a fragging investigation. A medic might treat the wounded from an ambush, and later confront the consequences of heroin use in the same camp. A sergeant trying to keep younger troops steady might find himself policing not only military standards, but the emotional wreckage of a war many no longer believed in. This was the military life soldiers were expected to remain inside. They were not allowed to dissolve into whatever behaviour the war seemed to justify. The rules still applied in the tent, the club, the latrine line, the supply yard, the rear compound, and the angry silence between men who had stopped trusting one another. That expectation could feel almost impossible at times. A soldier might believe that after weeks of patrols and sleepless nights, he had earned the right to drink until he disappeared. He had not. He might feel that heroin offered a small private ceasefire. It did not become permitted because it worked for an hour. He might think an officer who kept sending men into danger deserved to be frightened. Or worse, the law did not permit it. He might feel the weight of discrimination and lash out against the nearest target. The military still demanded restraint. He might see money moving easily through unofficial channels and decide that everyone was taking something. That did not make theft acceptable. These are not difficult rules to understand in calm retrospect. They were much harder to live by under sustained strain, which is precisely why commanders kept restating them, enforcing them, and in some cases redesigning policy around them. If we step back now and look across the whole subject, a pattern becomes clear. The Vietnam War did not place American soldiers outside rules. It placed them beneath a dense layer of them. They could not speak or display public opposition however they wished while in uniform. They could not refuse lawful orders simply because fear or doubt pulled at them. They could not wander wherever they liked beyond the wire, ignore curfews, or treat passes as suggestions. They could not carry home every weapon, relic, or battlefield object that caught their eye. They could not treat Vietnamese civilians as props, possessions, or targets of convenience. And once they returned to camp, they could not claim that vice, resentment, or exhaustion gave them permission to abandon discipline altogether. The war asked soldiers to obey in conditions that often felt unstable, unfair, and deeply confusing. The rules were the military's attempt to keep that instability from consuming everything around it. Sometimes they held, sometimes they failed badly, but they were there, shaping the boundaries of a soldier's life day after day. Imagine one final scene. A base in Vietnam after dark. The sky is black. Somewhere in the distance, artillery sounds like weather. Inside the wire, men are moving more slowly now. A sentry stands watch. An MP Jeep rolls along a road. A club has closed for the night. A lamp burns over paperwork in an office where someone is reviewing another disciplinary report. In a barracks, a man lies awake, staring at the ceiling, angry at the war, angry at command, angry at himself for being afraid. Nearby, another sleeps hard from exhaustion. Another hides a habit he cannot admit. Another counts days until rotation. Another wonders whether his friend in the next bunk can still be trusted. This is still the Vietnam War. Even though no patrol is moving through the jungle in this moment, it is the war inside the force. The part measured not in territory, but in whether a military institution under severe strain can keep its own men within the lines it has drawn for them. And that was the final thing US soldiers were not allowed to do in Vietnam. They were not allowed to become entirely ungoverned by the war they were fighting.